Fined $3,000 for daring to present evidence of her innocence. Jasmine Crockett stayed silent. But just seconds later, she played a video that led the FBI to handcuff the judge in the middle of the courtroom. The press exploded. The entire system shook. She said only one thing: the truth can't be bought. But has justice truly been restored? Or is this just the tip of the iceberg? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The courtroom hadn't opened yet, but for Jasmine Crockett, the war had already begun. Before sunrise, Jasmine woke with purpose. No hesitation, no doubt. Her DC apartment was silent, lit only by the glow over a table stacked with legal briefs and marked-up rulings. Today, she wasn't just defending herself. She was standing up to a machine built to silence people like her. She tied her curls back, slipped into her blazer, and stared into the mirror. "They want to erase me," she said, steady and low. "Not today." The city outside was still asleep, but Jasmine Crockett was wide awake and ready for war. Just days earlier, billionaire media titan Veronica Langley had filed a $15 million lawsuit accusing Jasmine of defamation for stating publicly, "Tax dollars shouldn't fund extremist programming." No names were mentioned, but Langley made it personal because it was her empire Jasmine had rattled. And now she was using the courts to finish what outrage culture had started. Jasmine wasn't surprised. Langley was powerful, connected, and ruthless. She owned newsrooms, funded campaigns, and had 4 senators on speed dial. The judge, James Boasberg, a name that rang alarms. His rulings had always leaned one way, and Jasmine knew exactly which way that was. But she wasn't walking into that courtroom to apologize. She wasn't there to play defense. She was there to fight, alone if she had to, with nothing but the truth in her hand and a recording no one saw coming. She stepped into the courtroom, and the air changed instantly. No warm welcomes, no formal neutrality, just a heavy silence layered with judgment. Jasmine Crockett walked with calm, but every eye in the room followed her like she didn't belong there. As she approached the defense table alone, no legal team, no advisors, Veronica Langley turned slowly from her plush leather chair at the plaintiff's bench. Her eyes swept over Jasmine's simple navy suit and worn briefcase. A smirk curled on her lips. "No lawyer?" she said dryly, not even bothering to lower her voice. "This might be quicker than I thought," her attorney chuckled under his breath. "Hope she brought a pen. She'll need one to sign the settlement papers." Jasmine sat without flinching. She placed her files neatly on the table, hands steady. She had heard worse in back rooms and press briefings and late-night threats and TV smear campaigns. This wasn't new, but what was new was how open the hostility was today. Judge James Boasberg entered seconds later, his robe billowing slightly as he took the bench. He didn't look at the room. He looked only at her. The corners of his mouth curled downward, like he had already made his decision. "Well, well," he said, voice cool but laced with bite. "Ms. Crockett, representing herself, I see. Bold move, or maybe just naive." His tone dripped with mockery. "Let's hope you know more about law than slogans." The courtroom didn't gasp. It was too used to this kind of power play. But the gallery shifted. A few interns raised their eyebrows. A court reporter paused her typing. Boasberg continued, leaning forward, elbows on the bench like a man preparing to grill. "I'll say this once," he said firmly. "This is a court of law, not a press room, not a political theater. If you plan to turn this into some viral circus, I'll shut it down fast. Understood?" Jasmine met his gaze squarely. "Understood, Your Honor," she replied, even and controlled. Her voice didn't crack. It didn't rise. But under that quiet tone was something steel-hard, a tension even Boasberg noticed, but pretended not to. He glanced at Langley's team and nodded with faint approval. "Plaintiff, your witness list is in order. Your exhibits pre-approved. I assume we'll move swiftly today." Then his gaze snapped back to Jasmine. "Defense, I expect no procedural antics. If you're unprepared, say so now. I won't have this court's time wasted on amateur hour." Jasmine didn't answer right away. Instead, she slowly opened her binder, revealing numbered tabs, printed precedents, and court transcripts. Everything organized, Everything ready. I came here to defend myself, Your Honor, she said clearly, and I'm fully prepared to do so. No theatrics, just facts. Boasberg raised an eyebrow. We'll see, he muttered almost dismissively. But I've seen confidence from self-represented defendants before. Usually lasts until cross-examination. A low chuckle came from Langley's corner. Jasmine heard it, ignored it. Her pulse was steady, but deep inside she knew exactly what this was. Not just a trial, but a performance, with the script already written and her role cast as the loser. The difference was, she didn't follow scripts, and she had a twist ending none of them saw coming. And then the assault began, not with shouting, but with precision. Judge Boasberg gave a curt nod. Mr. Feldman, proceed. The room stilled. Cyrus Feldman rose slowly, like a lion stretching before the kill. His suit was dark, sharp, expensive. Everything about him was deliberate, from the silk pocket square to the slight pause before he spoke. Your Honor, he began, his voice like polished steel, we are here today because of a calculated statement, one that did real measurable damage. This isn't about opinion. This is about destruction. He turned toward the gallery as if addressing an audience far beyond the courtroom. My client, Ms. Veronica Langley, has spent over 2 decades building a media network that provides diverse voices a platform, sometimes progressive, sometimes provocative, but always protected under the First Amendment. Until that protection was weaponized against her. He snapped open a file and held it up. Exhibit A, viewership dropped by 22.7% within 72 hours of Ms. Crockett's statement being aired nationwide. He dropped it on the table with a thud. Exhibit B, 3 major advertisers, Heron Tech, Madison Bank, and Beacon Brands, pulled out, citing public concern, fear of backlash, brand misalignment. Their words, not ours. Feldman paced slowly, each step echoing. Now, Ms. Crockett would have you believe this was just a generic policy comment, something harmless, vague, theoretical. He stopped, looking directly at Jasmine. But let's be clear, she's no amateur. She's an attorney, a former civil rights litigator. She knows the power of language better than anyone in this room. His voice tightened. She stood in front of a national audience and said, tax dollars shouldn't fund extremist programming. She didn't name Langley. She didn't have to. The public connected the dots. That's how smear campaigns work. Implication over identification. He gestured toward the projector. A series of images flickered onto the courtroom screen. Charts showing viewership collapse, highlighted tweets calling Langley a fraud, leaked emails from ad execs expressing panic. Then came screenshots from YouTube, with Jasmine's quote repeated under bold red headlines. She called them extremists. Langley's empire under fire. One video had over 4 million views, another over 10,000 angry comments. She set the spark, Feldman said, pointing to the screen. The internet did the rest, but she lit the match. He turned back to the bench, dropping the tone of performance for one of cold accusation. The defense may try to argue this was opinion, but the law is clear. When someone in a position of authority speaks recklessly, knowing it can cause reputational harm, it crosses the line into defamation, especially when the target is identifiable, even if unnamed. He picked up a document, contractual loss statements, initialed by executives. The damages aren't hypothetical, Your Honor. They're on paper. They've already happened, and Ms. Langley is owed justice. Jasmine remained perfectly still. She didn't fidget, didn't blink, but every blow Feldman delivered was designed to make her appear smaller, outmatched, like a reckless lone wolf who'd barked too loud and now couldn't take the heat. Across the room, Langley sat like royalty. Perfect posture, expensive pearl earrings, that same smug expression. This wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a public shaming, and Jasmine knew it. As Cyrus Feldman returned to his seat, radiating confidence, the courtroom shifted its gaze to her. Judge Boasberg leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen like he was already bored. Defense, he said flatly, if you have a response, make it quick. Jasmine stood slowly, spine straight, eyes calm but unyielding. The weight of the room pressed down, but she wore it like armor. "Your Honor," she began, voice clear and steady, "this case is built on smoke and spin, but the law is built on precedent. And the precedent is crystal clear." She held up a single sheet of paper. New York Times versus Sullivan, 1964, a cornerstone of First Amendment protection. In that decision, the Supreme Court ruled that public officials, and by extension, public figures, cannot claim defamation unless they prove actual malice. She stepped forward, pacing slowly, deliberately. Actual malice means that the speaker either knowingly lied or acted with reckless disregard for the truth. That's the standard. Not hurt feelings, not public reaction, and certainly not business losses tied to someone else's interpretation of a general remark. Her tone sharpened, eyes locking on Feldman. "My statement didn't name Ms. Langley. It didn't name her company. It didn't call out a specific show, host, or platform. It was a broader comment on public spending, on taxpayer responsibility, a policy opinion." She turned back to Boasberg. "And political speech, especially from public officials, is the most protected form of speech under our Constitution. That's not just legal theory. That's the law." Boasberg's lips twisted slightly, unimpressed. "Are you lecturing the bench now, Ms. Crockett?" he asked, a faint sneer forming. A few people in the gallery chuckled. Jasmine didn't even blink. "I'm citing binding precedent, Your Honor," she replied, measured but firm. "And if this courtroom values the Constitution as much as it claims to, then the First Amendment isn't up for negotiation." Feldman raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Langley leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, visibly irritated. Jasmine pressed on. "If this court allows vague public reaction to override legal standards, then you're not just punishing me. You're setting a dangerous precedent that chills speech for every official in this country." But Jasmine wasn't done. Not when the truth was sitting right in front of her. After citing New York Times versus Sullivan and laying the foundation of constitutional protection, she took a slow breath, then reached into her binder. The courtroom watched as she pulled out a crisp, clearly labeled document, the official transcript from the press briefing in question. "Your Honor," she said, walking calmly to the evidence table, "this is the complete certified transcript of my statement, recorded by the Office of White House Communications. Every word, every sentence, no edits, no omissions." She held it up, her voice steady but ringing with quiet urgency. "It shows in black and white that I never mentioned any individual, any program, any network, or any company, certainly not Miss Langley or her platforms. This case is built on an interpretation. This document is built on fact." She placed it down gently, as if laying the first stone of a foundation. "This transcript doesn't just support my position, it demolishes the plaintiff's narrative. Their entire case depends on the idea that my words were targeted and malicious. This proves they weren't." She took a step back, hands clasped in front of her, giving the court space to process. A long beat passed. Boasberg stared at the document, then at Jasmine, lips curling slightly as if she'd just spilled coffee on his desk. Then came the blow. "This document," he said slowly, "is irrelevant." His gavel didn't come down, but his voice cracked like a whip. "You are not here to argue over a transcript, Ms. Crockett. You are here because your statement created impact. This court is concerned with consequences, not your intentions." The silence was sharp. Even Cyrus Feldman blinked, surprised by how quickly the judge dismissed it. Jasmine stood still, as if frozen for a moment, her eyes fixed on Boasberg. "With respect, Your Honor," she said carefully, "the plaintiff's case hinges on the content of my statement, not on reaction. If we don't examine the actual words I said, how can this court assess whether harm was even possible?" Her tone was measured, almost pleading, but not out of weakness. It was logic battling against the impossible. Boasberg leaned forward, eyes narrowing like a man who'd already made up his mind before stepping into the courtroom. "Ms. Crockett, this is not a philosophy seminar. This is a courtroom, and I will not allow this proceeding to be derailed by grandstanding over paperwork." Jasmine didn't break eye contact. "This isn't paperwork," she replied evenly. "It's the truth. You're dismissing proof that directly refutes their claim, and you haven't even read it." The judge slammed his gavel once, loud enough to jolt the room. "That's enough. If you want to make speeches, try your luck on cable news. Here you answer to the law, and I decide what matters." The threat landed with full weight. The gallery tensed. One reporter's fingers hovered above their laptop keyboard. A clerk glanced up, clearly unsettled. Everyone could feel it. Something was wrong. Jasmine stepped back, not retreating, but recalibrating. "Then I respectfully ask the court to acknowledge that it is choosing to ignore exculpatory evidence." Her voice was low now, not raised but powerful in its restraint. "I entered this courtroom with respect for the process. I'm not asking for favors. I'm asking for fairness. If the truth can't be reviewed in this room, then what exactly are we all doing here?" Judge Boasberg's face twitched. For a split second, something flickered. Discomfort, maybe even embarrassment. Then it was gone, replaced by cold, stony rage. He leaned forward, knuckles pressed into the bench, eyes hard as glass. "You are dangerously close to contempt, Miss Crockett." Jasmine didn't flinch. "I'm not disrespecting this court," she said evenly. "I'm defending myself with facts, with evidence that directly rebuts a multi-million-dollar defamation claim. That's not defiance. That's due process." A hush fell over the room. Every head turned toward the bench. What would the judge do? Address the merit of her words, or punish her for daring to speak them? Boasberg didn't hesitate. He slammed the gavel down, once, twice, 3 times, the sound sharp and violent. $3,000, he snapped. "Contempt of court, effective immediately." The words came out not like a ruling, but like a strike. No hearing, no warning, no legal basis cited. Just raw authority, weaponized in full view of everyone. "This is my courtroom," he said, voice rising. "Not a platform for speeches, not a political rally, and not a soapbox for someone trying to make headlines. If you can't follow the rules, Miss Crockett, you can leave." Jasmine stood frozen, but not from fear. Her jaw clenched, her eyes locked on him, with a stare that didn't beg for mercy. It held him accountable. Her hands, still holding the transcript, didn't move. She could have exploded. She could have shouted. But she didn't. That silence said more than words ever could. "You're abusing this bench, and we both know it." The courtroom was suffocatingly still. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys, too stunned to type. One reporter leaned toward another and whispered, just loud enough for the rows behind to hear, "He's trying to bury her, no matter what it takes." Another voice added, "He didn't even read the transcript." The courtroom was frozen in silence. Jasmine didn't argue. She didn't plead. She just breathed, one slow, steady breath, then moved with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind. She reached into her briefcase and retrieved a small black USB drive, unmarked, simple. The kind of object no one notices, until it detonates everything. She walked calmly to the side table where the courtroom projector was connected, inserted the drive into the terminal, and typed a command. The monitor blinked to life. Judge Boasberg raised an eyebrow. "What do you think you're doing, Ms. Crockett?" he snapped. "This court has not approved." Jasmine interrupted him, not with words but with the screen. It began in grainy black and white. A security camera feed, time-stamped 3 weeks ago. Location, Garage B3, private access, East Side Towers. The footage was silent, but every person in the room leaned forward instinctively. The setting was unmistakably real. A dimly lit underground parking lot with concrete beams, security mirrors, and fluorescent bulbs buzzing faintly overhead. Then came movement. From the left side of the screen, Judge James Boasberg walked into frame. He wasn't wearing his robe. He wasn't in court. He wore a dark trench coat, collar up, face cautious. He looked around briefly, then stepped toward a shadowed corner near the far wall. A man approached, taller, younger, dressed in a sleek charcoal suit. He carried something small in his hand, a white envelope, fat with contents. No words were exchanged. The camera angle caught everything. The envelope was passed. Boasberg took it, paused, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. And then he spoke. Crystal clear audio synced in, his voice unmistakable. "Tell her not to worry. This one will be wrapped up quick." Then came the handshake, 2 seconds long, firm, familiar, and the screen froze. Jasmine turned slowly to face the bench. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This is your judge," she said evenly. "That was your parking garage. And that," she pointed toward the frozen image of Boasberg pocketing the envelope, "is your justice system." You could hear a pin drop. A single bead of sweat ran down the judge's temple. He opened his mouth, desperate to speak, to reassert control, but no words came. "Just breathe." Then he snapped. "Turn that off!" Boasberg shouted, banging his gavel so hard it echoed off the marble walls. "This is illegal. This is a violation of federal courtroom." His voice cracked, halfway between rage and panic. "That footage is inadmissible, and anyone who uses it will face charges." And then the courtroom erupted. It wasn't noise in the traditional sense. It was something deeper. The sound of an entire room unspooling at the seams. Gasps shot through the gallery like electricity. Phones flew up. Cameras began flashing with the urgency of history being made. Reporters leapt from their seats. Someone dropped their coffee, and the splash on the tile echoed like a gunshot. Every person in that room knew something irreversible had just happened. Jasmine didn't move. She stood still as stone, the giant projection behind her frozen on the image of Judge Boasberg, clutching the white envelope. That's when the FBI agent made his move. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark navy suit stepped forward from the back of the courtroom. His stride was exact, purposeful, lethal. No hesitation, no drama, just the precision of someone executing a federal warrant. With a flick of his wrist, he produced his badge and held it high, speaking above the chaos in a voice that instantly commanded the room. "Judge James Boasberg, by order of the United States Department of Justice, you are under arrest for accepting bribes and violating the Federal Judicial Integrity Act." His words fell like thunder, clear, unshakable. Not a suggestion, a sentence. Boasberg, still frozen behind the bench, blinked twice as if the reality hadn't fully landed. Then his lips parted. "What? What are you talking about? That video, it's manipulated. This is political theater." His voice cracked. The robe that once cloaked him in authority now looked oversized, like a costume worn too long. He backed up a step, eyes darting to the clerk, then to Feldman, then to Langley. No one moved. No one helped. The agent stepped closer, his partner flanking the side. "Sir, you are instructed to step away from the bench immediately. If you resist, we will be forced to detain you with force." There was no room for interpretation. This wasn't a hearing. This was a reckoning. Boasberg's voice turned shrill. "You can't do this. I'm a sitting federal judge. I am protected under—" Click. The sound of handcuffs snapping shut was unmistakable. One agent had already come behind him, gripping his wrists and locking the cuffs tight. Boasberg flinched as the cold steel dug into his skin. His face twisted, not in pain, but in disbelief. The kind of disbelief that only comes when a man who thought he was untouchable suddenly isn't. In the gallery, phones were held high. Reporters were whispering frantically into microphones. A live stream was already running on 3 national networks. Cameras captured every second. Boasberg being pulled from the bench, his robe flaring slightly, his face pale and slick with sweat. History wasn't waiting for the evening news. It was happening live. And then all eyes turned to Langley. She hadn't moved. Not when the video played. Not when the arrest was announced. Not when her hand-picked judge was dragged from his throne. Now she sat stiff in her chair, back ramrod straight, skin drained of color. Her breathing was shallow. Her lips parted once, but no sound came. Even Feldman had taken a step back from her, as if instinctively distancing himself from a sinking ship. She glanced at Jasmine for the first time in the entire trial, not with arrogance or contempt, but with something far closer to fear. Jasmine held her gaze for only a second. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Instead, she turned back to face the courtroom, calm, resolute, centered in a moment that had been built brick by brick from the injustice she'd been forced to endure. And when she finally spoke, the words didn't rise above the chaos. They cut right through it. "The truth," she said softly, "is the only thing money can't buy." And this time, the silence wasn't shock. It was respect. It was the sound of power shifting. of a courtroom remembering what justice was supposed to feel like. And for the first time that day, no one dared speak over her. The echoes of the gavel had barely faded, and already the courthouse was in freefall. The courtroom, once the arena of calculated arguments and veiled threats, now felt like ground zero. People were standing, murmuring, some openly staring in disbelief at the empty bench where Judge Boasberg had just been seated minutes earlier before being led away in handcuffs. The clerk tried to maintain decorum, but the illusion of control had collapsed. The bailiff's voice cracked through the noise. This session is now in recess until further notice. No one questioned it. The law had just turned on itself. Veronica Langley and Cyrus Feldman didn't make a statement. They didn't hold their heads high. They didn't even protest. They simply slipped away through the side consultation chamber, shoulders hunched, eyes lowered, like architects of a failed coup. No cameras followed. No reporters chased them. The media didn't need their side anymore. The story had moved on. Jasmine Crockett had just turned a legal proceeding into a national reckoning. Outside, the air was electric. The scene in front of the federal courthouse of the District of Columbia was unlike anything the city had seen in years. News trucks lined the block, satellite dishes spinning, generators humming. Anchors stood on boxes, adjusting earpieces and shouting into cameras. Live feeds from all major networks flooded the airwaves. The hashtags had already gone viral. Boasberg arrested, Langley Gate, justice served, and Crockett storm. Twitter was melting. TikTok clips of Boasberg's arrest hit 1 million views before his booking photo even cleared the system, and in the middle of it all, one moment rose above the digital noise. Not through a phone, but through a voice. A local news crew was doing man-on-the-street interviews when they turned their mic toward a man standing quietly near the courthouse steps. He wasn't holding a sign. He wasn't shouting, just watching. His name was Walter Branson, a 70-year-old Vietnam War veteran, wearing a fraying field jacket, a U.S. Marines baseball cap, and a row of campaign ribbons that hadn't been touched in years. At first, the reporter treated him like any other interview, standard filler. But Walter didn't give them filler. He gave them the truth. "I've watched D.C. eat its own for 5 decades, he said, eyes never leaving the courthouse entrance. And I've seen cowards in nice suits let good people get torn apart because they were scared of losing power." He paused. The reporter leaned in. "But that girl, Jasmine Crockett, she walked straight into the lion's den and pulled the teeth right out of its mouth. No notes, no bodyguards, just the truth." His hand trembled slightly, but his voice didn't. "She did what 100 senators didn't. She didn't wait for someone else to fix it. She stood up. Alone." The camera panned in. Walter adjusted his hat and looked straight into the lens. "You want to know what courage looks like? It ain't a flag, it ain't a speech. It's a black woman with a USB drive and the guts to call out a crooked judge to his face. That's what America was supposed to be. And I'm damn proud to be alive to see it." The video aired live. Within 10 minutes, it was clipped, subtitled, and shared by millions. Walter Branson for president began trending. People were crying in comment sections. A former Supreme Court clerk tweeted, "That man just said more truth in 60 seconds than I've heard in the last 10 years of hearings." Inside the courthouse, Jasmine sat alone at the defense table, the room slowly emptying around her. Her hands were still on the table, one resting on the transcript Boasberg had refused to read, the other on the USB drive that had detonated a scandal. Her eyes weren't on the reporters or the cameras. They were on the seal of the court carved into the wall across from her. For the first time since the trial began, she allowed herself to exhale. She hadn't just won a motion. She had shifted the balance of power, and the country had noticed. Because what happened that day wasn't just about one corrupt judge or one media titan. It was about something deeper. It was about a woman, once dismissed, mocked, fined, and ignored, who stood up not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told their truth didn't matter. And by the time the sun began to set over Washington, D.C., America wasn't asking, "Who is Jasmine Crockett?" anymore. It was asking, "Where do we go now that she's shown us the truth?" The fallout from Boasberg's arrest hadn't even settled into memory before a new figure entered the courtroom. And with her came an entirely different kind of gravity. Judge Margaret Ellis was no stranger to high-profile cases or public scrutiny. A former federal prosecutor and the first woman appointed to the D.C. Circuit from a nonpartisan recommendation panel, she had built her reputation not on theatrics or ideology, but on a singular, unshakable quality: integrity. When she entered the courtroom, she didn't need to announce order. Her very presence imposed it. The gallery quieted. The media lowered their voices. Even Langley's legal team sat straighter. Ellis glanced at the case file, then looked directly at Jasmine. This court will proceed under the standards of due process, impartiality, and federal law, she said, her voice calm and commanding. The defense may now present all evidence previously blocked or suppressed. For Jasmine Crockett, it was the moment she'd bled for. She stood slowly. No dramatic flair, no grandstanding, just a woman carrying the weight of weeks of legal sabotage and public humiliation. But in her eyes burned something new: vindication within reach. Her first act was simple, but devastating. She walked to the center of the courtroom and laid out a thick folder of previously dismissed documents. The full time-stamped transcript of her press briefing, signed affidavits from 3 nonpartisan communication staffers who had been present, and the official media log confirming that no specific individual, network, or organization was named or targeted. Not once, not even indirectly. This transcript, she said clearly, was refused by the previous presiding judge. But today I ask the court to consider what it plainly shows: that the plaintiff's central claim is not only unsubstantiated, but demonstrably false. Judge Ellis reviewed the top pages, then nodded. "It will be entered into the record. Please continue." And Jasmine did. She called her first witness, a senior communications analyst from the Office of Government Ethics. Under oath, the analyst confirmed that Jasmine's comments were consistent with ongoing budget discussions inside the White House, statements regarding public funding of entertainment content, not personal attacks. Jasmine then introduced audience data, ratings trends, and advertising revenue trajectories from Langley's media holdings, showing a steady decline in numbers months before her press conference. Every point Feldman tried to raise in rebuttal, every angle, every twist, every narrative reshaping, was met with a direct citation of federal case law. Jasmine invoked New York Times versus Sullivan to dismantle the argument of reputational harm, Falwell versus Flint to reinforce protections for public discourse, and Milkovich versus Lorraine Journal Company to clarify the distinction between opinion and actionable defamation. At one point, Feldman pivoted, visibly sweating, trying to frame Jasmine's remarks as part of a coordinated political smear, reading from a handful of outraged tweets and email excerpts from Langley's advertisers. Jasmine didn't blink. "Those tweets," she said calmly, "are from members of the public reacting to their interpretation of my words, not the words themselves. Reactions do not establish malice. The First Amendment does not shield you from discomfort. It shields the speaker from punishment for making uncomfortable truths known." She then walked to the evidence screen and clicked through side-by-side comparisons of her speech and the statements misrepresented in Langley's lawsuit. The contrast was brutal. In one column, carefully worded commentary about federal spending on media. In the other, a media narrative that had been spun into outrage by headlines, not by Jasmine. By the third hour of testimony, Judge Ellis had begun taking notes by hand. The courtroom was hanging on every word, not just for drama, but because the truth was finally breathing again. One journalist whispered, "She's teaching a masterclass." The court clerk, who had flinched under Boasberg's rulings days earlier, now typed with steady hands. Even some of the jury consultants from Langley's side were exchanging nervous glances. Feldman made one last effort, a desperate plea to emotion. He spoke about the irreversible damage to Langley's legacy, the stress she'd endured, the advertisers who pulled out. "No amount of legal parsing," he said, "can undo the very real financial pain caused by Ms. Crockett's words." Jasmine didn't interrupt. She waited, then walked slowly to the front of the room and said, clearly, coldly, truthfully, "Pain is not proof. Feeling offended is not the same as being defamed. If it were, every honest conversation in America would end in a lawsuit. We are not here to protect egos. We are here to protect rights. The plaintiff may be wealthy, she may be powerful, but what she is not is entitled to rewrite the Constitution because she didn't like how it felt to be challenged." And in that moment, something changed. Judge Ellis set down her pen. The room was silent again, not out of fear, but out of awe. Because Jasmine Crockett had walked through fire, and now she stood unburned. The courtroom was no longer a trap. It had become a mirror, and it was finally reflecting the truth. It began with silence. Not the kind that creeps in when people don't know what to say, but the kind that follows something seismic. The kind that hangs in the air after a building has just withstood a quake. Judge Margaret Ellis reviewed her notes one final time. Her pen rested gently on the leather folder before her, the gavel untouched for the moment. Then she looked up, eyes scanning the courtroom with sharp, even clarity. Her gaze landed on Jasmine Crockett, who stood poised, unflinching, hands resting lightly on a folder of now validated truth. Judge Ellis spoke, her voice measured and deliberate. In this courtroom, the law must remain sovereign, not money, not status, and not emotion. She paused. After thorough review of the evidence presented, transcripts, expert testimony, verified witness statements, and relevant federal precedent, it is the ruling of this court that the defendant, Ms. Jasmine Crockett, did not engage in defamation. Her comments were political in nature and made within the scope of her role as a public communicator. As such, they are protected speech under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. She took a breath, then delivered the words Jasmine had waited weeks to hear. The plaintiff's complaint is dismissed in full. The effect was immediate and visceral, a breath caught in someone's throat, then a ripple of disbelief, and then a swell. The public gallery, full of journalists, veterans, students, and citizens who had watched this trial unfold in real time, erupted into a standing ovation. It wasn't chaotic, it wasn't disrespectful, it was cathartic, like the pressure valve on a broken machine had finally been released. People clapped with reverence, not just celebration. Applause filled the chamber, growing louder as Jasmine stood quietly, letting it wash over her without raising a single hand. Her expression was calm, but her eyes glistened. Because beneath that silence she held inside was the memory of every moment she had been silenced. Langley sat motionless, lips tight, as if still trying to calculate the damage. Feldman had gone pale, eyes darting toward the exit, his legal pad now forgotten. The courtroom no longer belonged to them. Judge Ellis waited for the applause to quiet, then continued, her voice unwavering. In addition to this ruling, this court will be submitting a formal report to the Federal Judicial Conduct Council detailing the behavior and conduct of former presiding Judge James Boasberg. His prior suppression of evidence, hostile courtroom demeanor, and ethical violations constitute a breach of public trust. The judiciary cannot and will not protect its own when integrity is compromised. There it was again, that breathless hush, this time not out of shock, but of reckoning, a judge calling out another judge, not behind closed doors, but in the full light of day. Jasmine closed her folder gently. It wasn't just about her name being cleared. It was about the truth standing taller than power, if only for a moment. The price had been high. She'd been mocked, fined, threatened, and nearly railroaded by a system built to protect people like Langley and Boasberg. But now that same system, however bruised, had no choice but to admit what had been there all along. Outside, the country was already watching. CNN's live ticker flashed. Case dismissed, Crockett exonerated. MSNBC called her the woman who held the line. Fox News declared, Crockett shreds the narrative, Constitution wins. Hashtags were trending worldwide. Number Justice awakens, number Ellis over Boasberg, number Crockett crushes corruption, and number she did not blink. TikTok flooded with clips of her courtroom rebuttals. Law students shared annotated transcripts. Veterans sent tributes. Civil rights activists called her testimony a modern blueprint for legal resilience. But Jasmine wasn't watching the news. She was still standing at the defendant's table, surrounded by silence once again. This time, a silence that felt like peace. She looked at Judge Ellis and nodded respectfully. The judge returned it with something more than formality, something almost like admiration. Jasmine turned to leave, walking down the center aisle, where once eyes had judged her. Now they followed her like a hero stepping off the battlefield. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She walked quietly, almost humbly, carrying only the truth, and the proof that no amount of money, power, or manipulation could erase it. And as she reached the doors, someone in the crowd whispered what the entire country would soon repeat. She didn't just win, she changed the rules. The courtroom victory may have cleared her name, but Jasmine Crockett knew it was only the beginning. One corrupt judge had fallen, but the system that empowered him still stood. Beneath the applause, beneath the headlines, the real work was just starting, and Jasmine wasn't about to walk away while the wounds of others remained wide open. 2 weeks after the verdict, she stepped into a room she never thought she'd see from this side of history. Room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building, where the House Judiciary Committee held its most consequential hearings. The walls were lined with portraits of lawmakers long gone. The air was stale but heavy with precedent. Reporters packed every seat in the press box. Live feeds were rolling on 4 major networks. And in the center of it all sat Jasmine, alone behind a polished oak table, with a nameplate that now read Ms. Jasmine Crockett, Washington Liberty Alliance instead of defendant. The committee chair banged the gavel. This hearing will come to order. Jasmine adjusted the mic. Her opening statement was short, but lethal. I am not here as a lawyer. I am not here as an activist. I am here as a survivor of a system that tried to silence me for telling the truth. A stillness fell over the chamber. She launched into her story, not with emotion, but with clarity sharpened by experience. She spoke of being dragged through a trial over a political statement, of evidence blocked and dismissed, of being fined for defending herself. Then she pivoted swiftly and surgically to something larger. My case was public, she said, but the injustice isn't unique. For every one of me, there are 100 others who don't get a camera or a hashtag, just a verdict delivered by someone they never had a chance to question. Then she dropped the numbers. 22 documented instances in the past 5 years where federal judges failed to recuse themselves from cases involving financial or political conflicts of interest. 11 instances where formal complaints of judicial misconduct were quietly dismissed by internal review panels. Only 1 public censure. 0 removals. She named names, showed receipts, and she backed it up with copies of FOIA requests, legal analysis from independent scholars, and interviews with whistleblowers, all entered into the record. The room didn't gasp, it froze. And then came her final act, the unveiling of a proposed bill, co-authored with legal scholars, backed by civil liberties organizations, and now gaining bipartisan support on the Hill. Its formal name, the Judicial Ethics and Public Accountability Reform Act. But even the committee chair, a gray-haired veteran from Connecticut, called it what the headlines already had, the Jasmine Act. The proposed legislation was historic in scope, a mandatory judicial ethics disclosure database available to the public, an independent federal judicial oversight board composed of legal professionals, former judges, and citizen representatives, annual conflict of interest audits of all federal judges, a streamlined, transparent misconduct complaint system with investigatory power outside the judiciary itself, term limit recommendations for Article 3 judges pending constitutional review. This is not a punishment, Jasmine told the committee. It's a safeguard, because power without oversight is how people like James Boasberg become more dangerous than the criminals they sentence. A young congresswoman leaned into her mic. Ms. Crockett, are you suggesting that judicial corruption is widespread? Jasmine didn't blink. I'm saying we don't know, because we never bother to look. She wasn't angry, she wasn't theatrical, she was relentless. And the room listened, because the truth had already proven itself in open court. A few skeptical members tried to poke holes in her plan, citing budget constraints, judicial independence, and constitutional separation of powers. But Jasmine was ready. Judicial independence means freedom from political pressure, she said. It doesn't mean freedom from consequences. No one should sit on a federal bench with the power to ruin lives and zero accountability to the people they serve. By the time her testimony ended, the atmosphere in the chamber had shifted. What began as a procedural hearing had become a national moment. Outside the Capitol, Protesters held signs not of outrage, but of hope. Back the Jasmine Act. Accountability is patriotic. No more secret judges. News outlets flooded the airwaves. The Washington Post called it the most ambitious judicial reform package in 50 years. The New York Times featured a cover story titled, "How One Woman Took the Bench to Trial and Won." On social media, the movement exploded. Activists, legal professionals, students, and even former judges posted their support using the hashtags Your Jasmine Act Now and Restore Justice. But Jasmine didn't linger in the spotlight. After the hearing, she stepped out of the building, past cameras and questions, and whispered to an aide, "Let's get back to work." Because for her, this wasn't a victory lap. It was just the next case. And this time, the defendant wasn't a single judge. It was the system itself. And Jasmine Crockett was ready to prosecute. After Jasmine Crockett's explosive testimony on Capitol Hill, the political landscape across America felt like it had been hit by a quake. Word spread quickly that her proposed Jasmine Act, aimed at overhauling judicial oversight, wasn't just a one-off dream. In Washington, D.C., officials began implementing the earliest provisions of the new model, which featured mandatory ethical disclosures, public complaint databases, and real-time audits of judges' potential conflicts of interest. At first, many observers scoffed, claiming local jurisdictions would never mirror the bold steps taken in the nation's capital. But something unexpected happened. Citizens began demanding change, lining up at town halls and confronting their elected representatives, pressing them to adopt the same or similar reforms. It was no longer just about political grandstanding. It was a groundswell, a fierce wave of popular support from people who had finally glimpsed the possibility of genuine judicial accountability. Social media exploded with grassroots movements like Adopt the DC model and Reform is Patriotic, led by law students, community activists, and even a few high-profile judges who'd grown weary of protecting corrupt peers. The pressure mounted quickly, and state legislators across the country realized they could no longer ignore the public's outcry. By the end of that month, the conversation had moved beyond DC's immediate sphere, because states from coast to coast were waking up to a new reality. Illinois was among the first to step up, galvanizing bipartisan support for what local newspapers called the strongest judicial ethics overhaul in a generation. Lawmakers there introduced a sweeping bill resembling the DC framework, requiring every judge to submit annual financial disclosures on all personal and family-held assets. Gone were the days of burying investments in obscure trust funds or masking potential conflicts of interest through complicated corporate shells. In Chicago, a city riddled with historical political scandals, this sudden transparency felt downright radical. Yet the public response was overwhelmingly supportive, as citizens packed county auditoriums to voice their backing for a system that would hold judges to the same standards as any public servant. The debates on the State House floor reached a fever pitch when an investigative journalist unveiled data linking a long-serving judge to real estate deals underwritten by city contractors. Activists rallied, demanding the immediate passage of the Integrity in Courts Act, which mirrored Jasmine's blueprint in almost every clause. Even skeptical politicians soon realized they could either adapt to the wave of reform or risk being swept away in the next election cycle. Meanwhile, in Arizona, political desert storms brewed over the possibility of adopting the new framework. Critics claimed it would create a judicial witch hunt, stoking paranoia and undermining the independence of the courts. However, supporters argued that without accountability, independence was meaningless, a shield for hidden corruption rather than a safeguard of impartial justice. In Phoenix, the governor organized a special commission to study the DC model. Included were retired judges, law professors, and even grassroots leaders who had once been dismissed as fringe activists. Their findings were damning. Over half of the complaints filed against Arizona judges in the last decade had been dismissed without a hearing, often due to vague standards or conflicts of interest among the reviewers themselves. When the commission publicly endorsed a near-carbon copy of the Jasmine Act, it caught many career politicians by surprise. But the ground had shifted. Constituents were more informed and engaged than ever, thanks to the steady drumbeat of national coverage triggered by Jasmine's infamous showdown with Boasberg. By the time a crowd of 5,000 gathered outside the state capitol, brandishing signs that read, "Justice above all" and "Let Arizona lead," the legislature knew the momentum was unstoppable. Over on the East Coast, Maryland took a distinctly grassroots approach to implementing similar measures. County councils began sponsoring open forums where residents could voice grievances about their experiences in family court, traffic court, and small claims court. A cascade of stories emerged revealing how often decisions were influenced by intangible, sometimes personal factors. A group of volunteers collaborated with local media outlets to map out repeated patterns of bias across different judges, something previously impossible without a formal structure for data collection. As that map circulated online, viral hashtags like #OneNation9 mapped the corruption and judges on notice sprang up, rattling a judiciary unused to such intense scrutiny. In a particularly dramatic session at the Baltimore City Council, a woman tearfully described how her case had been dismissed by a judge who attended the same golf club as her ex-business partner. That story, broadcast live, ignited a wave of public outrage so forceful that lawmakers were practically compelled to endorse a measure resembling D.C.'s mandatory disclosure rules. In a narrow but decisive vote, the measure passed, setting the stage for a statewide referendum that might well transform Maryland's judicial ethics framework forever. Kentucky, initially resistant to any reform that challenged local traditions, experienced perhaps the most unexpected pivot of all. Traditionalists in the state Senate had dismissed the D.C. model as too big city, scoffing at what they perceived to be bureaucratic red tape. But then came a scandal involving a circuit judge who allegedly received lucrative gifts from a private corrections company. Rumors flew about lavish dinners, weekends at a lakeside cabin, and hidden campaign donations. Reporters who'd previously ignored the realm of judicial oversight suddenly found themselves chasing a major story. Public trust, once taken for granted, began to plummet. Spurred by the humiliation, a group of young lawmakers decided enough was enough. They introduced a motion adopting key points from the Jasmine Act: annual financial disclosures, independent oversight bodies, and mandatory recusal if any direct or indirect conflict was found. Though older senators tried to downplay it, labeling the scandal an isolated incident, calls for their resignations began echoing through local radio talk shows. Under mounting pressure, Kentucky's Senate authorized a study committee to draft a final bill that mirrored D.C.'s reforms, with near unanimous votes in both chambers once the public learned the depth of the alleged corruption. Suddenly, what had seemed like an alien concept from a distant capital became the lifeline of Kentucky's battered judiciary. Tennessee, Colorado, Michigan, and even heavily conservative states like Wyoming soon followed suit, each adapting the D.C. model to local contexts. In many places, the catalyst was simple, undeniable logic. If the nation's capital, often mocked as a swamp of lobbying and partisanship, could clean up its judiciary, why couldn't they? Politicians found themselves hard-pressed to argue against transparency, especially once the storyline of a single woman, Jasmine Crockett, taking on a corrupt judge resonated in every corner of American media. Political strategy memos began circulating, advising candidates that standing against judicial reform was akin to career suicide. The momentum became a tidal wave, fed by nightly news segments that tracked each state's progress and criticized those dragging their feet. Newspapers carried daily editorials calling for a new era, quoting Jasmine's testimony about how power without scrutiny is a threat to democracy, no matter how you dress it up. Governors and attorneys general convened emergency sessions. Mayors held town halls. The public, once apathetic about procedural matters, now spoke the language of audits, disclosures, and independent oversight like it was part of the national DNA. In every state house implementing these reforms, there were tense debates and last-minute attempts at sabotage. Lobbyists representing big law firms or corporate interests tried to water down key provisions. Some judges pushed back, claiming they were being vilified for the sins of a few. But the wave of popular support always won out. People remembered Jasmine standing in that D.C. courthouse, overshadowed by power, yet refusing to bow. They recalled the moment Boasberg was led away in cuffs, a living reminder that no one was above scrutiny. The images of that day became the rallying cry. We can't let it stop here. Citizens demanded robust ethics codes, mandatory recusal rules, and third-party audits that would release findings straight to the public. From the largest metropolises to the smallest rural counties, a new philosophy took hold. The justice system belonged to them, not to a select group shielded by archaic traditions of secrecy. By the time the reforms were in various stages of passage across 15 states, journalists were already calling it the Jasmine Revolution. Scholars argued over whether the changes went too far or not far enough. Cable news anchors debated if states were merely riding a populist wave rather than implementing thoughtful, incremental policy. Through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained notably reserved. She didn't do many press tours or anchor interviews, preferring to let local leaders shape their own solutions. She publicly stated, "This was never about me. It's about giving everyday people the power to trust in the courts that judge them." And the people believed her. Opinion polls showed the highest confidence in judicial institutions in decades, a surge many attributed to the wave of new transparency and the ripple effects of her stand. That wave, stronger than any single scandal or political whim, continued to build. Long-standing judges began choosing early retirement over disclosing questionable financial ties. Newer judges discovered a sense of public duty they'd never felt before. Law schools adjusted their curricula to teach cases not just about legal theory, but about the ethical frameworks now sweeping through the states. And beyond all this, citizens finally felt they had a seat at the table where justice was served. They stood in line to file complaints, sure, but they also showed up to volunteer for oversight committees or to watch real-time data on judicial performance posted online. The entire system was transforming from the inside out, with Washington, D.C. as its unlikely beacon of change. As the reforms continued to unfold, the story of Jasmine Crockett and her improbable journey from beleaguered defendant to catalyst of nationwide reform became a parable of civic power. If one woman could crack the walls of a fortress built to protect the unaccountable, imagine what a nation, newly awakened, could do. And the states, once wary of D.C.'s influence, were now tearing down walls of secrecy in their own courthouses, unveiling a future where judges might finally fear no one except the people to whom they answered. Jasmine Crockett's return to Yale Law felt like something out of a political thriller rather than a mere speaking engagement. She arrived on a crisp autumn morning, the centuries-old Gothic spires casting long shadows across the courtyard, where students lined up in droves to catch a glimpse of the woman who had single-handedly toppled a corrupt judge. Administrators had scrambled to find a venue big enough, ultimately deciding on the largest lecture hall, which filled to capacity an hour before the event. Outside, more students braved the chill, hoping the live feed from inside would do justice to the electricity buzzing through campus. When Jasmine finally appeared at the front of that immense hall, every whispered conversation died away, replaced by hushed anticipation. She wore a simple dark suit, no frills, no flashy jewelry, yet her mere presence carried the authority of a movement that had gripped the nation. As she scanned the room, she caught sight of professors who had once taught her torts and constitutional law, now looking at her with a mix of pride and awe. Meanwhile, on the balcony level, a group of visiting alumni in tailored suits observed intently, as if witnessing the birth of a modern legal icon. And behind them, unnoticed by many, were half a dozen news cameras perched like silent sentinels, ready to broadcast her words to a country still caught in the fever of reform. When Jasmine finally spoke, her voice carried the calm conviction of someone who had faced the system at its worst and lived to tell the tale. "I didn't destroy the system," she said quietly, pausing just long enough to let the words land. "I merely exposed those who exploited it." A murmur rippled through the crowd like distant thunder. Cameras zoomed in on her face, searching for any hint of nerves, but her expression remained focused, more teacher than politician, more champion than celebrity. She detailed her journey from an eager Yale law student, passionate about civil rights, to a defendant persecuted by a judge's personal vendetta. Each sentence reverberated with the authenticity of a person who had learned, through blood and heartbreak, that justice was often less about lofty ideals and more about everyday perseverance. She acknowledged the heartbreak of countless defendants across the country whose valid complaints had been dismissed by biases hidden behind a robe. Then she segued into the reforms blossoming nationwide. The new transparency measures, the ethics committees, the rash of state legislatures adopting frameworks inspired by her experiences. At that point, a dozen students stood in the back, leaning forward as though her words were the oxygen they'd been waiting to breathe. Her keynote address concluded with a pointed reminder. This country's greatest strength isn't our laws. It's our willingness to change them when they fail us. As the room erupted into applause, Jasmine set aside the podium to answer questions. Eager hands shot up from every corner. Bright-eyed 1Ls fresh out of undergrad, jaded 3Ls who had already seen the legal system's cracks, and even visiting professors who spent their careers researching the intersection of law and ethics. One student hesitated, then asked about the fear of backlash. Did Jasmine ever worry about angering the wrong people, especially with so many powerful interests lurking in the shadows? Her answer was quick, laced with humility, but also steel. I fear a world where justice is sold to the highest bidder more than I fear any backlash. The applause came again, bolder this time. Then she opened up about the letters she'd been receiving, letters from former convicts who claimed they'd been railroaded by biased judges, from single parents stuck in custody battles where backroom friendships tilted the scales, from law students in small towns who felt stifled by the old guard. Each letter, she explained, reminded her that her fight was never just personal. It was the tip of an iceberg holding millions of unheard stories. That notion, she said, propelled her forward more than any official recognition ever could. In the weeks following her talk, Yale's campus was abuzz with an energy rarely seen, and Jasmine became something of a mythic figure among the law students. They discussed her speech in the cafeteria, dissected her arguments in study groups, and even formed a new student organization called Defenders of Judicial Integrity, with membership tripling in its first month. Meanwhile, outside the ivy-covered walls, news outlets ran story after story about the letters pouring in from across the nation. Victims who believed they'd been wrongly convicted wrote about how Jasmine's story gave them hope that the system could be forced to listen. Law firms received calls from prospective clients citing her case as evidence that, finally, judges would have to think twice before shutting them down. Some conservative commentators accused her of grandstanding, but the tide of public opinion was overwhelmingly in her favor. In one unforgettable editorial, a prominent columnist wrote, "In an age of cynicism, Jasmine Crockett has done the unthinkable. She's restored our belief that law can be a sword for truth rather than a shield for corruption." At night, in dorm rooms and apartments, young law students replayed her talk, some in awe, others with tears of inspiration, determined to follow in her footsteps and carry the torch of reform wherever the law had grown dark. Before long, prominent legal scholars began comparing her to Clarence Darrow, whose fiery courtroom style once championed the powerless, and to Sandra Day O'Connor, the trailblazing Supreme Court justice, who forged her own path through a male-dominated judiciary. Jasmine shied away from such lofty parallels, often saying, "I'm not an icon, I'm just someone who refused to be quiet." Still, the comparison stuck, and the label of civil rights hero became harder to dodge. Visiting campuses across the country, she encountered tearful parents grateful for her stand, ex-inmates who found renewed faith in the possibility of appeals, and even hardened prosecutors who privately admitted they'd started examining their own biases. At Yale, she was invited to teach a short seminar on judicial ethics, a packed event where seats filled within minutes. Professors who once critiqued her first-year moot court technique now praised her real-world mastery of the law's most crucial test, defending truth against power. And every day more letters arrived, some from halfway around the globe, praising her for taking on the Goliath of judicial corruption and proving that one voice, when persistent, could reshape an entire system. In the end, when asked if she ever felt overwhelmed by the avalanche of expectation, Jasmine would only smile and recall the darkest moment of her trial, the moment she realized that the courts weren't only about black-robed figures and dusty books, they were about people's lives, their families, their futures. I'm not destroying the system," she repeated, echoing the line that had turned her talk at Yale into a national rallying cry. "I'm just refusing to let anyone hide behind it." And for a new generation of lawyers, activists, and ordinary citizens, That was the kind of defiance they'd been waiting to see. An unstoppable force that made the impossible feel suddenly, wonderfully possible. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Just 5 minutes after calling Joe Biden a failed president, Jasmine Crockett was fined $100,000 right there in federal court. No papers, no lawyer, just the truth and a will that wouldn't flinch. Then 1 minute later, the unthinkable happened. The very judge who fined her was slapped in handcuffs, on live stream in front of millions. The clink of those cuffs echoed like a siren, signaling the end of an era ruled by unchecked power. But what did this one woman say that made the entire American justice system the one on trial? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The wind cut through Washington, D.C. like a knife. But outside the federal courthouse, the air was on fire. On one side, Trump's supporters waved flags and chanted, "Let Jasmine speak." On the other, counter-protesters yelled, "Protect the rule of law." The square felt like a powder keg. One wrong move, and it would blow. Then a black SUV pulled up. The door opened, and Jasmine Crockett stepped out. Former White House press secretary under President Trump, she needed no introduction. No guards, no speech. Just sharp heels, a cold stare, and silence from both sides. Her coat snapped in the wind like a cape. Eyes fixed on the courthouse, she walked with purpose, like she knew the storm ahead and planned to walk through it. Inside courtroom 4B, tension tightened like a noose. At the bench sat Judge Elias Marston, 67, stone-faced, appointed by Biden and known for punishing loud conservatives. But this case wasn't just political, it was personal. Jasmine had once exposed his ties to a shady PAC in a brutal congressional hearing. He never forgot. When she walked in, their eyes met like old enemies. Marston adjusted his glasses with purpose. Jasmine didn't blink. She walked to the podium without hesitation, as if daring him to strike first. The judge leaned back, tapping his gavel once, a warning shot. Everyone in the room felt it. Not justice, not law. This was revenge, dressed in robes and ready to play judge, jury, and executioner. The courtroom door clicked shut behind her, sealing out the roar of the crowd. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Every eye tracked Jasmine Crockett as she walked to the witness stand, not with hesitation, but with the calm precision of someone who knew exactly what she came to do. No binder, no legal team, just her memory, her conviction, and the truth. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens frozen midair. Judge Marston sat still, lips pressed thin, watching like a snake waiting to strike. Jasmine adjusted the microphone, glanced briefly at the packed gallery, then turned her gaze to the judge himself. Her voice, low and cutting, broke the silence like glass underfoot. "Has anyone in this room ever stood in El Paso," she asked, "when a mother collapsed in the dust, holding her dead child who died of thirst in the desert?" Silence. A reporter stopped scribbling mid-sentence. One juror's hand trembled slightly. Jasmine let the words hang in the air, like smoke after an explosion. She didn't blink. She didn't back down. She just let the truth sting everyone it touched. She paused just long enough for the weight of her words to settle, then stepped forward again, the mic barely catching the edge of her voice. But every word hit like a rifle crack. "Let's stop pretending this is theoretical," she snapped, eyes narrowing. 53 people cooked alive in the back of a trailer in San Antonio, in America. They gasped for air while temperatures hit 150 degrees inside that death box. "Do you know what that smells like, Judge Marston? Do you? Flesh, heat, panic, and policy failure. But no one was fired. No one took responsibility. The same people who opened the gate walked away from the graves they helped dig. And you call that progress?" The room stiffened. Her voice rose, not yelling but sharpened steel. They weren't statistics. They were mothers, fathers, children. People who believed what the President of the United States told them. That our border was open? that this country had room, and instead, we gave them death. Silent, slow, and suffocating. And you want me to be polite about it? Her eyes scanned the courtroom, daring anyone to interrupt. No one moved. She clicked her tongue softly, then continued, her tone colder now, more surgical. And let's talk about the numbers you people like to ignore. 2.3 million illegal border crossings in 2022 alone. That's not a leak. That's a flood. That's every man, woman, and child in Houston walking across the border twice. And don't you dare sit there and call it compassionate. Border Patrol is drowning. Rural hospitals in El Paso and Yuma are at capacity, treating people who were promised care we can't provide. Entire towns in Texas are being overrun, not by people, but by chaos. And what does Washington do? It claps. It holds press conferences. It brags. Her lip curled. You know what that is? That's not leadership. That's negligence in a suit and tie. Still, she didn't pause. And while we're flooded with bodies at the border, fentanyl moves like water. She tapped the podium with each word. 100,000 dead last year, gone. Lives snuffed out by tiny blue pills laced with poison pouring in from Mexico. Do you know what parents are doing now, Your Honor? They're buying Narcan for their kids, middle schoolers, and praying they don't die at a sleepover. That's the new American ritual. Backpacks, lunchboxes, overdose kits. And this administration still has the nerve to say, our plan is working. A gasp came from the gallery. Jasmine kept going, cutting deeper. You sit up there in that robe, demanding decorum while the streets outside this courthouse are soaked in the fallout of your silence. You want me to lower my voice because the truth is uncomfortable? Let me be very clear, Judge Marston. Her voice dropped, dangerous now. No one gave a damn about the rules when those families were torn apart at the border. No one respected court decorum when children died in shipping containers. And you want to fine me for this? For saying out loud what half the country already screams into their kitchen tables every night. She stepped forward again, fire blazing behind her words. You want me to lie for your legacy? You want me to call this collapse a policy debate? Not happening. This is blood. This is death. And I won't sugarcoat genocide just to make politicians feel comfortable. You can bang that gavel all you want, but the truth is louder. And it's going to keep ringing in your ears long after I leave this room. The final word of her indictment still echoed in the marble chamber when Judge Marston slammed his gavel down like a hammer of judgment. Once, twice, 3 times. Louder each time, like he was trying to bury her voice beneath the sound. His face flushed red, the robe around his neck suddenly too tight. Miss Crockett, he barked, fury barely restrained. This is a court of law. You will maintain order. This is not a campaign rally. One more outburst, and I will hold you in contempt. The room froze. Cameras whirred. A few reporters looked at each other, silently wondering. Would she back down? She didn't. Jasmine stepped forward, her jaw set, eyes locked on him like a fixed rifle. She didn't shout. She didn't tremble. She spoke with the calm, deadly precision of a woman with nothing left to lose and everything left to expose. With all due respect, Your Honor, she began, her voice low and steady. If the truth sounds like an outburst to you, then it's not me who's out of order. It's this court. Her words dropped like lead. No one moved. She went on, voice rising only slightly but tightening like a vice. If this chamber is a place where people must whisper facts and sanitize grief just to satisfy the fragile egos of power, then this is no longer a courtroom. It is a stage, and you, sir, are not delivering justice. You're performing censorship. She paused, just long enough to let the silence work for her, just long enough to make Marston's grip tighten around that gavel. Do you want order? She snapped. You want neat, quiet compliance while mothers cry over bodies, while kids in middle school carry fentanyl test strips in their backpacks. You want decorum while Border Patrol officers sleep in their trucks because the stations are full? You want restraint while millions of Americans are drowning in the consequences of failed policies that no one in this building has the courage to name? She leaned closer to the microphone now, every syllable sharpened like a blade. Let me tell you what this really is. This is a system that prefers silence over truth, reputation over accountability, and power over people. And that, Your Honor, is the real disorder. Judge Marston slammed the gavel again. Miss Crockett, I said that's enough, he growled. You are dangerously close to contempt. Do not test this court. But Jasmine didn't even blink. Her voice cut back in, stronger, faster, like a dam had broken and the flood could no longer be stopped. You threaten me with contempt? Go ahead, find me, cuff me, drag me out of here if that makes you feel powerful. But don't pretend you're preserving justice. You're preserving comfort. Yours, the administration's, the media's, and I will not contribute to your illusion. Not for a second. She stepped back, but her presence didn't shrink. It swelled. If the truth shakes these walls, she said, voice cold and defiant, maybe they were built on the wrong foundation to begin with. The silence that followed her words didn't just settle. It hovered, thick and electric, like the stillness before a storm breaks. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the judge, normally quick to strike back, sat frozen behind the bench, as if her defiance had cracked something deeper than courtroom decorum. Then, like dominoes falling in slow motion, a few reporters reached into their jackets and bags. Phones were drawn, not stealthily, but like weapons of truth. Red lights blinked on, cameras turned, screens lit up. The live streams began. In the front row, a young journalist from the New York Times whispered, "She's going viral." Another from Fox News simply mouthed, "Holy hell!" And still, Jasmine didn't move. She stood at the podium, shoulders squared, eyes forward, breathing steady, like she was built for this exact moment. Around her, the courtroom held its breath. Even the bailiff didn't shift. You could hear the hum of a phone battery, the soft click of a zoom lens locking in. It was no longer a trial, it was a battleground, and Jasmine Crockett had just become the eye of the storm. The courtroom had already become an electric wire of silence, pulled tight, vibrating with the tension of everything unsaid. But when Jasmine turned from the podium and locked eyes with Judge Marston, she wasn't holding back anymore. She didn't raise her voice for drama. She didn't wave her arms or pace like a politician. Her power was stillness, precision, fire wrapped in control. She spoke with a blade's edge. Joe Biden wasn't a leader. He was a catastrophic failure. His policies didn't just weaken America. They left it wounded and bleeding. And you, she paused, letting the weight of her words stack like bricks. You are the last man standing between accountability and the truth. You're not defending justice. You're defending a legacy soaked in blood. The courtroom didn't gasp. It stopped breathing. You could feel it in the air, the electricity of a room that just crossed a line no one could pretend away. A reporter's fingers hovered above a keyboard. One juror shifted as if to speak, then froze. Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood tall, chin raised, her voice like stone over steel. And in that moment, the courtroom didn't belong to the judge. It belonged to her. And that's when Marston snapped. He didn't just rise, he erupted. The chair behind him slammed into the back wall. His gavel crashed onto the bench so violently that the sound cracked through the chamber like a gunshot. The veins in his neck stood out like cords. "Enough," he bellowed, his voice fraying at the edges. "Miss Crockett, you are in contempt of this court. You have turned this proceeding into a circus, disrespecting the bench, defiling the oath, and poisoning this chamber with your political bile." Spittle flew from his lips. His hand trembled as he slammed the gavel again. "I hereby fine you $100,000, effective immediately. That's the price for turning a legal proceeding into your own propaganda platform." His voice cracked again, rage now giving way to something more fragile. Panic. People turned to each other, eyes wide. One woman clutched her pearls. A man in the gallery whispered, "He just lost control." A camera light blinked on, then another. But Jasmine didn't move. Her hands gripped the podium like anchors. She didn't respond. She didn't even blink. She let the number hang in the air like smoke. $100,000, a six-figure punishment for truth spoken plainly. And that's when it happened. From the back of the gallery, a voice, worn, gravelly, forged in war, pierced the room like thunder. "You find someone for telling the truth," the man shouted, "then this ain't America anymore." All heads turned. Slowly the speaker stood, tall despite age, spine stiff as discipline. He wore a navy blue jacket with faded patches, and a Vietnam veteran's cap sat firm on his silver head. His eyes weren't filled with rage. They were filled with heartbreak. "I bled for this country," he growled louder now. "And I didn't do it so some judge could shut people up for speaking what they've seen." A second passed, then another. Then someone clapped, then two more. Then half the gallery was on its feet, not shouting, not chanting, just standing, in solidarity, in grief, in resistance. Jasmine turned slowly to face him, and for the first time that day, something shifted in her eyes. Not pride, not satisfaction, but reverence. She nodded once, not as a thank you, but as an oath. They were now bound, not by politics, not by ideology, but by the cost of truth in a system rigged against it. And at the bench, Marston stood helpless, gavel in hand, robe clinging to his sweat-soaked back, realizing too late that power isn't given by position, it's taken by courage. The veteran's cry still echoed in the courtroom like a battle horn. The judge froze mid-reach, unsure whether to gavel again or simply stare. For a moment, the balance of power had shifted, and everyone felt it. Jasmine, her eyes cold with clarity, didn't wait for another word. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her phone, not with hesitation, but with the calm finality of someone about to strike the match. The screen lit up. Her thumb hovered briefly over the live stream button on X. And then she pressed it. The signal went out instantly, and a red dot appeared at the top of the screen. Live, public, unfiltered. She raised the phone to eye level, looked directly into the lens, and spoke. "Right now," she said, her voice sharp and unflinching, "you're watching this government fine an American citizen $100,000. Why? Not for lying, not for violence, but for saying something true. Joe Biden weakened this country, and I'm being punished for saying it out loud." Her words hit the stream like a bullet through glass. In the first 30 seconds, 10,000 viewers flooded in, then 20, then 50. Comments began flashing across the screen like tracer fire. "Are you serious? This is insane. She's right. They're scared of her." Inside the courtroom, phones buzzed. Reporters turned their cameras toward Jasmine, abandoning their notepads. Outside, the feed was picked up by a nearby news van, and within minutes her voice echoed through external loudspeakers pointed toward the crowd. At first it was a trickle, pedestrians pausing, heads turning. Then came the wave. One woman clutched a sign and began shouting, "Jasmine!" Another man, former Marine by the look of him, echoed the cry, "Jasmine!" Dozens of voices joined in, then hundreds. It rolled across the street like a tsunami, crashing against the courthouse walls. "Jasmine! Jasmine!" Inside, the floor almost vibrated from the noise outside. Live stream viewership surged past 100,000, then 150,000, then 300,000 in under 3 minutes. The digital world was waking up in real time, and Jasmine Crockett was no longer a defendant. She was a symbol, but she wasn't finished. Her hand steady, she angled the phone slightly upward and locked eyes with the camera. Her voice didn't crack. It sharpened. "If $100,000 is the price for telling the truth, then fine. I'll pay it, but I won't pay it in silence." Her tone dropped, calm but burning. "I'll pay it in taxes, in protest, in every breath I take until this system is rebuilt. I'll pay it with my career, with my comfort, my peace. Hell, I'll pay it in blood if I have to, but I will never pay it by shutting up." In the background, Judge Marston looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. He gripped the edge of the bench, face pale, mouth slightly open, watching a courtroom he once ruled be overtaken by a woman with a phone and nothing left to lose. Even the bailiff didn't move, unsure whether to enforce the judge's silence or obey the weight of the moment now broadcast to hundreds of thousands of citizens. Jasmine took one final breath and delivered her closing line. Not to the court, not to the judge, but to every viewer on the other end of the live stream. They want to bury the truth under fines and fear. Well, we were never meant to be quiet, and I'm not going anywhere. The crowd outside roared again. The counter ticked past 400,000, and the system that tried to silence her was now being heard by the world. Across Washington, behind 3 layers of security clearance and reinforced glass, the air in the Justice Command briefing room was colder than the courthouse, but no less electric. The lights were dim, and the only illumination came from the wall-sized screen broadcasting the federal courtroom live. Pam Bondi stood front and center, her arms crossed, a carved stillness in her posture. Her expression gave nothing away, but her eyes never left the screen. On it, Jasmine Crockett stood unwavering, the storm of history swirling around her, the chants of "Jasmine, Jasmine," bleeding in from the streets. Then came the gavel, then the fine, then the veterans shout, "If truth gets you fined, this ain't America anymore." Bondi didn't blink. She'd seen it coming. Behind her, 2 aides hovered by a terminal, one holding a legal tablet, the other watching social media feeds tick past like a slot machine. Viewership, 700,000, 812,000, over 1 million. The nation was watching in real time as the veil slipped. But Bondi already knew what was behind it. She'd spent months preparing for this moment, waiting not just for proof, but for public ignition. Now it was here. Without a word, she walked across the room to a tall, steel filing cabinet against the wall. She keyed in a 6-digit code and opened the top drawer. Inside was a single black binder, thick and heavy, marked only with a red sticker and the name in block letters. Marston, Elias, Judicial Oversight, Dossier 96A. She pulled it out like a weapon. The room fell silent. She placed the file on the conference table and flipped it open, page by page. Internal ethics complaints buried by court clerks, a pattern of disproportionate fines against conservative litigants. 2 whistleblower reports redacted and shelved without review. A confidential letter from an appeals judge who'd warned that Marston's courtroom increasingly resembles a political war zone rather than a legal forum. Bondi read it again, not because she had to, but because she wanted to feel the weight one last time before she pulled the trigger. She turned to her chief legal aide, who looked up from his tablet, already sensing what was coming. "Do we have confirmation the arrest warrant is complete?" she asked, voice controlled but sharp enough to slice steel. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "Signed and sealed last Friday. Ready to execute." She nodded slowly, then looked back at the screen. Marston was still shouting, gavel hammering, face blotchy with rage. He looked powerful, but everyone in that room knew the truth. He was cornered, lashing out because the truth had exposed him. Bondi stared at him for one last beat. Then she spoke, firm, final, and louder than necessary. "Activate the warrant." The aide blinked. "Ma'am, now?" Bondi didn't even turn her head. "Now," she said. "He fined a woman 6 figures for saying the president failed. That's not a judge. That's a loyalist with a robe and a grudge. The moment's here. No more delays." She reached for the folder, snapped it closed with a satisfying clack, and looked the aide dead in the eye. "It's harvest time." Within seconds, the command was sent through encrypted channels to the U.S. Marshal Service field team, stationed blocks away from the courthouse. Code blue authorization lit up on the dispatch board. 4 officers were already in place, 2 more deployed immediately. The wheels of consequence, long stalled by red tape and political hesitation, finally began to spin. And for the first time in Judge Marston's career, justice was coming for him. The second hand ticked past 10:08 a.m., and something in the air shifted. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, an unseen force sweeping through the room like a cold front before a storm. The double doors at the rear of the courtroom flung open, not from haste, but with controlled finality, and every single head turned. Conversation died mid-sentence. Pen clattered from a reporter's hand and hit the floor, forgotten. Even Judge Marston, halfway through another lecture from the bench, froze like a man who'd just seen his reflection in a coffin lid. Pam Bondi had arrived. She stepped into the chamber like a closing argument, measured, calm, undeniable. Dressed in a tailored black suit with silver trim, Bondi didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her authority moved in the room like gravity. Flanking her on either side were 4 federal agents in tactical jackets, their expressions flat, professional, eyes scanning every inch of the courtroom with silent precision. Their badges gleamed under the halogen lights. Their gloves were already on. They weren't here for questions. They were here for justice. Bondi walked with perfect cadence, each heel strike a countdown. 4, 3 dots, 2 dots, 1. When she reached the midpoint of the aisle, she stopped, faced the bench, and raised a folded document in one hand. It bore the seal of the Department of Justice in bold red ink. She unfolded it like a final verdict, her voice cutting through the room like a sniper's shot. "Judge Elias Marston," she said clear and loud, "you are hereby placed under arrest for willful abuse of judicial authority, political coercion under color of law, and direct violations of the United States Constitution, as detailed in Federal Warrant 442B. The sound of it, the finality of it, struck the room like thunder on marble. For a moment, there was silence, and then the room erupted. People leapt to their feet. Cheers tore from the gallery with the raw energy of release. Phones shot into the air. Reporters whispered, "Oh my God," into their recorders. Spectators cried, clapped, pointed, screamed. A woman near the front row broke into sobs and whispered, "We're finally being heard." Outside, through the thick courthouse walls, the chants of the crowd surged louder as a word hit the street. "Marston's being arrested." The judge stood frozen behind the bench, face pale, lower lip trembling. You can't," he began, but the words stumbled and fell. "This is outrageous. I am a federal judge." His voice cracked. "I have immunity." Bondi didn't blink. "Not anymore." The lead marshal moved forward. "Sir, place your hands behind your back." When Marston didn't respond, the agents moved in with quiet, mechanical precision. His robes shifted awkwardly as they took his wrists, turned him, and pulled his arms behind his back. There was no struggle, only disbelief. The metallic click of the cuffs echoed in the chamber, sharp and unmistakable. A reporter near the front gasped. Another whispered, "That's the sound of history." And it was. It wasn't just the arrest of a man, it was the collapse of a fortress, the moment a pillar of unchecked power finally cracked under the weight of truth. The handcuffs weren't just tools, they were symbols, shining under courtroom lights like silver justice. 2 steel rings that said, "No one is above the Constitution." Jasmine Crockett stood motionless at the podium, her phone still streaming, her eyes locked on the man who had just tried to bury her in silence. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She simply watched, like a soldier who had outlasted the siege. And when Marston was turned toward the gallery, now cuffed and no longer cloaked in judicial immunity, a sound rolled through the crowd that would follow him forever. It wasn't laughter. It wasn't hate. It was relief. And somewhere in that storm of cameras and applause, someone whispered, "Those cuffs sound like freedom ringing." By the time the gavel stopped echoing and Judge Marston was marched out in handcuffs, the world had already shifted. Jasmine's live stream, still raw, still archived online in full, was no longer just a recording. It had become a testament. One woman, one phone, one act of unwavering defiance captured in real time, with millions watching from their phones, tablets, televisions, and office desktops. By the end of the day, the official view count on her X, formerly Twitter broadcast, had surged past 1.2 million views, and still rising every minute. The clip of her declaring, "If $100,000 is the price for truth, I'll pay it in blood," had been subtitled in Spanish, Portuguese, Farsi, and Mandarin by user volunteers. In schools, break rooms, fire stations, people watched, and they remembered. But something deeper happened beneath the numbers. By nightfall, Jasmine's campaign donation page, once a quiet corner for supporters of her legal reform initiatives, was hit with a tidal wave of contributions. But not a single message said, "Use this to pay the fine." Not one. Instead, the messages said, "Don't pay them anything. Frame it. Make that receipt a monument." And Jasmine understood immediately. They weren't helping her avoid the cost. They were helping her own it. Donations didn't just come from expected places. A single mother from Nebraska donated $5 and wrote, "I watched that live stream with my 11-year-old daughter. She said you reminded her of Rosa Parks. Frame that receipt so she knows we don't back down." A steelworker from Ohio contributed $1,000 and included a short note. "This isn't for court. It's for the frame. Get something bulletproof." A retired paratrooper from Georgia mailed in $20 cash with a napkin scribbled on in ballpoint pen. "Saw you speak. Felt like 1968 all over again. You don't owe a cent, but here's enough to hang that paper in gold." The messages kept coming, from veterans, from immigrants, from pastors and waitresses and truck drivers, and people who had never watched a political hearing in their life until that day. They weren't giving money to erase the moment. They were immortalizing it. They were saying, "We saw what they did, and we want that moment framed, not hidden." In Jasmine's office, the physical receipt had already arrived by courier, an official printed document stamped by the court. Fine, $100,000. Contempt of court. Crockett. Jasmine held it in her hand for a long time. Not bitterly, not with rage, but with the quiet steadiness of someone who knew she would never tear it up. Never burn it. This wasn't a debt. This was a chapter in history. That night, she didn't go home. She stayed at her office with a small team of aides and designers who worked overnight on a special frame, a thick mahogany border with tempered glass, an etched brass plate underneath that simply read, "The price of truth, paid in full." And when she hung it on the wall behind her desk, Jasmine didn't do it quietly. She streamed it live. "Some people pay fines to stay silent," she said as she clipped it into place. "I frame mine to remind the next person. Speak anyway." The donations never stopped, but neither did the echo of that day, because what started as a punishment became a monument. Less than 24 hours after Jasmine Crockett turned a $100,000 contempt fine into a nationwide rallying cry, the country was no longer asking if the justice system was compromised. They were asking how deep the rot went. Every major news network had switched to nonstop coverage. Morning headlines no longer spoke of Jasmine's courtroom confrontation, but of what would follow in its wake. Millions tuned in from every corner of the nation. Barbershops in Detroit, diners in Texas, precinct offices in Pennsylvania, living rooms in the Bronx. And at exactly 11:30 a.m., every camera lens locked onto a single podium beneath the marble seal of the Department of Justice. Pam Bondi stepped forward like a prosecutor on Judgment Day. No suit jacket, black blouse, no smile. Her expression was pure granite. She stood flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals and an aide with a locked briefcase chained to his wrist. The room wasn't just full, it was compressed, thick with tension. The smell of coffee, sweat, and ink hung in the air. The lights were too bright, the cameras too close. A single misplaced word could explode across the country in seconds. Bondi knew exactly what she was about to do. She approached the mic, no notes in her hand, just a closed leather folder. She stared down the rows of journalists, then looked straight into the main network camera. "Yesterday, we witnessed a moment that shook this country to its core," she said. "A sitting federal judge, Elias Marston, was arrested for judicial abuse, political bias, and constitutional violations in open court. But let me be very clear, he was not an outlier." She paused. You could hear someone inhale in the third row. Bondi opened the folder slowly, deliberately. "This morning, based on months of sealed investigations conducted by the DOJ, internal audit teams, and federal ethics panels, I am announcing formal inquiries into 12 additional federal judges across 6 states. All are suspected of abuse of authority, politically motivated rulings, unlawful suppression of speech, and improper coordination with external political entities." And then she read the names, one by one. Each name echoed through the room like a courtroom verdict. Each jurisdiction drew gasps. Chicago, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Phoenix, Sacramento, Newark. Judges who had long ruled without scrutiny. Names associated with high-profile suppressions, activist gag orders, and quietly dismissed whistleblower lawsuits. A reporter from the Washington Post dropped his pen. Another mouthed, "Oh my God." Bondi didn't flinch. These judges have been shielded for years by the assumption that robes grant immunity. We are here today to say they do not. The briefcase was unlocked behind her. Slowly, the aide pulled out its contents. 12 thick envelopes, each marked with a DOJ seal and a judge's name in red. No names were blacked out, no agencies spared. The press surged forward as photographers captured it from every angle. An unspoken message carved in leather and ink. The era of quiet corruption was over. A CBS reporter called out, "Were these judges politically aligned with the previous administration?" Bondi's answer was ice. "We are not investigating political affiliations," she said. "We are investigating actions, abuses of power. If those actions happen to protect the same political figures, that is the pattern, not the excuse." Another shouted, "Did Jasmine Crockett's testimony trigger these charges?" Bondi's eyes locked on the camera lens like a missile. "Jasmine Crockett didn't trigger this," she said. "She revealed it. The evidence was already there. We were ready, but it took her courage to light the match." For a long moment, no one spoke. Bondi looked across the room one final time, voice steady as steel. "We will not stop here. Every courtroom in this country that has turned into a political theater will be audited. Every abuse, every cover-up, every case buried under silence. We're digging it up. These 12 are just the beginning." Then she closed the folder, turned from the podium, and left without answering another question. Behind her, the cameras clicked like gunfire, and across the nation, one truth echoed louder than anything else. Justice was no longer blind. It had just opened its eyes and was making a list. It was just past midnight when Jasmine finally returned to her office. The building was quieter than it had been in days. Security had doubled, but the real noise, interviews, chants, reporters swarming outside, had faded for the night. Inside, the silence was thick, broken only by the hum of a small fan in the corner and the soft creak of her heels on marble tile. The walls, now decorated with framed headlines and that infamous $100,000 receipt, felt more like a war room than an office. Jasmine set her bag down, rolled her shoulders, and moved toward the desk where a stack of opened envelopes waited. Some neatly sorted, others clearly handled with reverence. Her aide had left a single one separate from the rest. It was unremarkable on the outside, just a white, slightly wrinkled envelope with Caldwell, Des Moines, Iowa, scrawled in shaky cursive. No return stamp, no donor ID, just a name. Beside it, a yellow sticky note read in blue ink. "This one hit different. You'll see why." Jasmine sat. She didn't rush. She peeled open the envelope as if it were a relic, not correspondence. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, folded with care but creased at the edges. The ink was slightly smeared in places, as if written slowly, with hands no longer steady. And when she unfolded it, her breath caught before she even read the first word. There was something in the way the pen had dug into the paper, every stroke firm and deliberate, as though the writer had spent years not saying what he now couldn't hold back another second. "Ms. Crockett, my name's Thomas Caldwell. I'm 68 years old. Been welding since I was 16. Started under my dad, finished under my own bad back and bad knees. I never went to college, never wrote anyone in Congress. Didn't think you folks listened to men like me, but yesterday, for the first time in my life, I turned on the news and heard my own damn voice coming out of someone else's mouth. You weren't polite, and thank God for that. You weren't careful. You were right. And when you called that man out, when you said Biden failed and Marston was covering it up, I stood up from my chair in the living room and started yelling. Not at the TV this time, but at the ceiling, at God, because finally somebody said it where it counted. Me and my brothers, we've been yelling into our beer cans and truck radios for 10 years, but nobody ever printed it. Nobody ever put it into the record. You did. And when they tried to fine you $100,000, I said, hell, frame the receipt and hang it next to the Constitution. You don't owe me anything, but I owe you this letter. Just so you know, we were watching. And we ain't just proud. We're standing behind you. All of us. Welders, factory men, veterinarians, people who never learn the right words but know when they hear the truth. You said it for us. That makes you ours now. Stay loud, stay brave. And if they try again, tell them Thomas from Des Moines said they can take that fine and Hang it where the sun don't shine. Respectfully, Thomas Caldwell, pipe welder, American, listener. Jasmine read the letter once, then again, then a third time, slower. Not because she didn't understand it, but because it hit somewhere no camera could reach. In the stillness of that office, where the walls bore the weight of headlines, policy drafts, and constitutional battle scars, this letter broke through like a quiet revolution. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about winning. It was about being heard by those who had gone unheard for far too long. She placed the letter on her desk and sat back. Staring at the ceiling, she thought of all the men like Thomas, the ones who weren't on social media, the ones who never donated before yesterday, the ones who saw their truth filtered, diluted, ignored, until someone said it without asking permission. She reached for her drawer and opened it slowly. Inside were campaign pins, pocket constitutions, old briefing notes from her time at the White House. She cleared a space, laid Thomas's letter flat inside, and closed the drawer with both hands, firmly like sealing a time capsule. Then she whispered aloud to the empty room, "They're not invisible anymore." And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't feel like a press secretary or a legal warrior or a lightning rod. She felt like a microphone finally turned toward the rusted corners of America, and a voice worth amplifying. The sun hadn't risen yet when Jasmine arrived at the edge of the old family ranch in Bell County, Texas. Fog still clung to the fields like breath on glass, and the early morning air smelled of damp earth, hay, and history. The old barn stood just as she remembered it, leaning slightly to one side, ribs of rusted tin peeking through peeling red paint, and the faded initials J.C. carved into a beam by her father's hand 40 years ago. She walked through the field in boots dusted from the night before, passing fence posts her grandfather had driven into the ground without machines, just a sledgehammer and conviction. This place wasn't just where she'd grown up. It was where she'd first learned what justice meant. Not from books, from consequences, from watching neighbors solve disputes with firm handshakes, not lawsuits, from watching her father walk into town and speak the truth, even when it made people uncomfortable. Now it was her turn. No press pool, no polished podium, just a single 4K drone hovering in the pale sky above, a stabilizer-mounted iPhone, and a handheld mic with a long cord dragging behind her, like a root in the dirt. Her communications aide asked if she wanted to write remarks down. Jasmine shook her head. "I don't need a script to tell the truth," she said. "I've lived it." And when she stepped in front of the camera, framed by the sun cutting through wooden slats like heaven slicing through the old, she didn't posture. She stood. "This is where I'm from," she began. Her voice, rich and unwavering, echoed just enough to remind everyone this was not a soundstage. It was home. Not D.C., not a studio. Right here, this barn, this dirt, this land. It raised me. She let that settle. "And I came back here for one reason," she continued, gaze narrowing as the words sharpened. "Because it's time we remember that justice isn't born under chandeliers. It's forged out here, in the quiet, in the hard work, in the places politicians forget." She motioned to the old barn behind her. "You see this place? It's held up by nails that outlasted 3 hurricanes, a dozen droughts, and 5 generations of storms. That's what justice should look like. But that's not what it looks like today." She leaned in slightly, voice like flint. "People like Judge Marston don't appear from nowhere. They are not mistakes of the system. They are the system, built by silence, fed by fear, protected by backroom deals in a culture that says, 'Don't rock the boat.' Well, the boat's already sinking, and I'm not here to row. I'm here to drain the swamp that's been choking our courts." The comment section on the live stream exploded. Hashtag barn speech, hashtag justice from the dirt, hashtag we hear you. But Jasmine wasn't watching. She was still speaking, and the fire in her voice burned hotter than the Texas sun that had begun to pierce through the fog. "They tried to shame me with a fine," she said, jaw tight. $100,000 for contempt. You know what that fine really was? It was a receipt for the silence they wanted to buy. But here's the truth. My silence is not for sale. Not at $100,000. Not at a million, not ever. She pulled something from her coat pocket. It was a photo of her grandfather, covered in soot, leaning against the same barn wall she stood in front of now, hands cracked, eyes tired but proud. She held it up. This man never wrote a bill, never gave a speech, but he knew right from wrong. He taught me to work with both hands and speak with one truth. He told me, if someone stronger tells you to sit down, it means your voice scared them more than your fists ever could. She looked back to the lens, gaze drilling through the screen and into the living rooms, garages, truck cabs, church halls, and firehouses where Americans were watching. So let me say this as clearly as I can, from where it all began. I will not stop. I will not stop until every corrupted judge is pulled from behind their bench and made to answer to the people they forgot. I will not stop until our courts fear the people more than they fear the headlines. I will not stop until justice stops being a performance and starts being a promise. Her voice cracked slightly, not from nerves but from grit. Marston was the first, but he won't be the last. A hawk circled overhead. The wind blew through the barn doors behind her, causing an old horseshoe nailed to the beam to clink gently, a tiny metallic heartbeat in the silence after her words. She took a breath, just one. Because this land, she said, placing her hand on the wood behind her, taught me something Washington forgot. When something is rotten, you don't decorate it. You dig it out by the roots. And with that, she stepped back from the mic. No anthem played. No applause roared. Only the wind and the sound of a country beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, justice could still grow from the dirt. The air in Washington was thick with anxiety. 3 days had passed since Judge Elias Marston was let out of his own courtroom in handcuffs. The footage had been viewed over 60 million times across platforms, and Jasmine Crockett's now iconic words, "Silence is complicity," were being quoted on protest signs, morning shows, and courthouse steps from Seattle to Tallahassee. But far from the cameras, something more chilling was unfolding. In the quiet, paneled offices of federal courthouses across the country, judges whose names had once drawn deference now felt the weight of a new kind of scrutiny. Bondi's list was no longer a rumor. It was real, and it was moving. Fast. The first to fold was Judge Stephen C. Wexler, a veteran on the Southern District Bench in San Diego. He had served for nearly 15 years, a Nixon-era conservative turned centrist in appearance, though his rulings told a different story. Wexler had dismissed over a dozen whistleblower complaints tied to military contractors, most without explanation. He was known among younger attorneys for his smirk when citing national security as grounds to seal inconvenient evidence. At 7:41 a.m. Monday morning, Wexler submitted a one-paragraph resignation to the office of the chief judge. No statement, no press conference. Just 6 typed lines citing a recent decline in health and a desire to focus on family. But according to a leaked internal memo from DOJ's Internal Affairs Unit, Wexler had been one of the top 3 judges under sealed surveillance for over 6 months. Jasmine's testimony and the Marston arrest had forced the department's hand. The second resignation came 5 hours later. Judge Lena Morales from New York's Eastern District had long been seen as immovable. Appointed under the Obama administration, Morales had presided over several high-profile immigration and civil asset forfeiture cases, many of which disproportionately impacted low-income defendants with no legal recourse. Her critics accused her of selective suppression of discovery evidence and repeated use of sealed transcripts to avoid appellate review. Her defenders called her a trailblazer, but by 1:05 p.m., her chambers issued a 2-sentence email to court personnel. Effective immediately, Judge Morales is stepping down from the federal bench. She will not be issuing further comments at this time. That afternoon, DOJ sources confirmed that Morales had been served 2 sealed subpoenas tied to coordinated communications with a now-defunct legal advocacy PAC that funneled donations from anonymous international sources. Bondi's press team declined to comment, but a cryptic tweet from her official DOJ account went viral. The first cracks always look like voluntary exits. By sunset, the media frenzy had detonated. CNN cut into its regular broadcast with a breaking chyron. 2 judges resign amid DOJ ethics sweep. Fox News aired side-by-side mugshots of Marston, Wexler, and Morales with the caption, "3 down, how many more to go?" Behind closed doors, panic surged. A source within the Federal Judicial Conference told Politico, "Judges are calling in favors, reviewing rulings, law clerks are shredding notes. There's a genuine sense that Bondi isn't bluffing." One former ethics advisor went further. "We are witnessing the first systemic purge of the judiciary in modern American history, and it's being led from outside the judiciary itself." Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She hadn't tweeted, hadn't given an interview. She didn't need to. Her silence echoed louder than headlines, because every resignation, every retreat, every judge who fumbled for a lifeline only proved what she had already said under oath. People like Marston don't appear out of nowhere. They're built, protected, and emboldened by a system that rewards silence and punishes truth. And now, for the first time in decades, that system was beginning to fear the sound of its own unraveling. The fallout from Judge Marston's arrest and the wave of resignations that followed sent shockwaves through every branch of government. But nowhere did the tremors hit harder than on Capitol Hill. What had begun as one courtroom clash had now become a full-blown constitutional reckoning. And just days after 2 federal judges stepped down in disgrace, Congress responded not with silence, but with steel. The morning sky over Washington, D.C. was thick with tension. Reporters crowded the steps of the Capitol. Helicopters hovered. Riot barriers lined the perimeter, though no protests had yet formed. Inside, behind closed mahogany doors and beneath the glow of antique chandeliers, a bipartisan coalition of lawmakers had worked through the night. Former rivals sat shoulder to shoulder, the usual smirks and smears replaced by a rare, heavy stillness. Everyone in that chamber knew this was history or catastrophe in the making. At 9:03 a.m., the Speaker of the House emerged from his office holding a thick folder, its navy blue cover embossed with 5 gold words that would soon dominate the airwaves. The Judicial Transparency Act. The Speaker's voice rang out, clear, almost solemn. "This is not a political maneuver. This is not about right or left. This is about restoring the very soul of the Republic. What we've seen in our courts in recent days has made one thing clear. When judges can no longer be trusted to uphold impartiality, then the law itself is on trial." The proposed legislation, introduced before a joint session, was swift and brutal in its scope. The Judicial Transparency Act would require mandatory public disclosure of all federal judges' financial holdings and political donations received in the past 15 years, a ban on judges accepting speaking fees, travel accommodations, or gifts from any entity with an active case in federal court, an independent review board composed of randomly selected retired judges, military officers, and constitutional law professors, empowered to audit judicial decisions for signs of bias or misconduct. And most controversially, live public video streams of every federal courtroom, no redactions, no sealed sessions, no backroom deals. Within minutes, the act lit a firestorm. Cable news anchors scrambled to translate legal jargon into plain outrage. Activists flooded social media with hashtags, #sign no more shadow courts, #sign judicial sunlight. Now #sign Marston was just the start. Progressive voices hailed the bill as a long overdue reckoning. Conservative firebrands called it an overreach, until a handful of their own constituents reminded them that it was their side being silenced in those same closed-door hearings. But in the heart of the storm, Jasmine Crockett stood quiet. She hadn't tweeted since her barn speech. Instead, she watched the House floor vote from a private room just off the Rayburn building, arms folded, jaw tight, the fine still unpaid, but framed behind her on the wall. When the gavel struck to begin the vote, her aide whispered, "They're listening now." Jasmine didn't smile. She just said, "Let's see if they have the spine to do more than clap." The count ticked forward on the chamber screen, 41-7, then 129-26, then 204-42. And finally, with 271 votes in favor and 159 opposed, the Judicial Transparency Act passed the House. Outside, a crowd of veterans, students, blue-collar workers, and small business owners erupted into cheers. Not because the war was over, but because, for the first time in a generation, Someone had struck a blow back. Back in the Capitol, reporters swarmed the hallways, chasing reactions. One asked Jasmine if she believed the act would really change anything. Her answer was immediate, unscripted, and sharp as steel. No law can change a man's character, she said, but it can change what happens when his character fails. That's what this is. It's not a cure. It's a lock on the back door. The Senate was next, and they knew they were on trial too. Behind closed doors, old power brokers tried to kill the bill quietly. Lobbyists emerged from Georgetown townhouses with thick folders and thin threats. One longtime senator reportedly muttered, "If this passes, half the judiciary retires by Christmas." To which another replied, "Then maybe that's exactly what needs to happen." By week's end, the Senate vote was scheduled. Jasmine flew home to Texas that night, back to the barn. The same wind rattled the rafters. The same soil crunched beneath her boots. But this time, she wasn't alone. 24 constituents stood waiting at the gate, holding handwritten signs that read, "Don't stop and keep digging." She looked at each of them: truck drivers, nurses, farmers, 2 high schoolers in faded ROTC jackets, and said only this: "We're not done." And somewhere deep in the walls of the Capitol, the system heard her footsteps getting louder. And once the Judicial Transparency Act passed the House, something began shifting in the soul of the country. Subtle at first, like pressure building beneath the surface. But by the end of the week, it could no longer be dismissed. Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a name trending on X, no longer just the face on a phone screen during that chaotic courtroom confrontation. She had become something else entirely, an archetype, a lightning rod, a living embodiment of justice that refused to bow. It didn't happen in a press release or some orchestrated campaign. It happened the way true movements always do, in whispers, in reposted videos, in the silence after someone says, "Did you see what she did?" It started when a school principal in Indiana opened morning announcements with her courtroom quote, "Silence is complicity." It deepened when a preacher in Birmingham replaced his Sunday sermon with a clip of Jasmine refusing to retract her words. And by the following Tuesday, a Texas high school debate team renamed their annual tournament after her, the Crockett Challenge, with the slogan, "Speak truth, no matter the cost." The media tried to keep up, but the groundswell had already passed them. In Des Moines, a retired pipe fitter started printing bumper stickers that read, "I'd rather pay the truth tax than live a lie. Jasmine Crockett." In Bakersfield, a local barbershop painted a mural of her next to Malcolm X and Ruth Bader Ginsburg with the words, "This is what courage looks like in a suit." She became a fixture on podcast thumbnails, her face next to headlines like, "The Woman Who Fought the Gavel," "One Voice versus the Bench," and "Jasmine Crockett and the Rise of Relentless Truth." But it wasn't just admiration that followed her. It was fear, and not hers, theirs. In federal buildings, hallway chatter turned into whispered warnings. Young clerks started hesitating before running interference for questionable judicial calls. Some judges, once arrogant in their insulation, now paused before issuing sealed rulings. The words, "Is this a Marston moment?" became shorthand for, "Is this the kind of thing Jasmine Crockett will burn to the ground?" She had become a mental check, a specter of public reckoning. And Jasmine? She didn't flinch. She refused television interviews for weeks. She didn't hire PR agents or accept awards. She just kept showing up. Courtrooms, veterans' halls, union meetings, armed only with a steel-trap memory and that same unflinching tone that made even sitting senators feel like they were under oath. At a town hall in Pennsylvania, someone shouted from the back, "You're braver than all of them combined." Jasmine didn't smile. "I'm not brave," she replied, voice like flint. "I'm just tired of pretending that cowardice is professionalism." The room went silent, then erupted. But the most profound shifts weren't in noise. They were in action. A group of law students at Georgetown formed the Crockett Doctrine Task Force, pledging to monitor every federal ethics filing in the next 5 years and publicly report questionable behavior. A veterans coalition in Georgia printed thousands of pocket-sized cards quoting her speech, "When power demands your silence, speak louder." One high school teacher in Michigan rewrote her civics curriculum to center around Crockett's hearing, calling it The most honest moment in American law since Watergate. Back in Washington, one senator muttered in frustration behind closed doors, "She's not even in office, and she's setting the legislative agenda." That's when they realized this wasn't about Jasmine Crockett being in the system. It was about her standing against it and still winning. When asked at a private event what she thought of being called America's conscience, Jasmine shook her head. "I'm not your conscience," she said. "I'm your mirror. If the reflection bothers you, change the face of power, not the one pointing at it." And that's exactly what people began doing. Candidates across the country, young, fierce, unpolished, began citing her. Civil rights organizations began reshaping their legal strategies to include media transparency tools. Even international human rights groups took notice. A nonprofit in Poland sent her a letter declaring her courtroom speech a model of democratic resistance in the face of judicial tyranny. But Jasmine never let the praise distract her from the battlefield. She kept a framed 100,000 contempt fine hanging crooked in her office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the cost. Every time someone asked if it had been worth it, she pointed to the file folder growing on her desk, titled "Next Judges to Watch." Because for Jasmine Crockett, the fight wasn't a moment, it was a mission. She was no longer just speaking truth to power. She was the power, not because she wore a robe, but because she didn't need one to be heard. And finally, in a country long strangled by silent courtrooms and sealed fates, someone had stood up and said, "You can find me. You can silence the cameras, but you cannot stop the truth once the people start watching." And they were watching now, more than ever. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just fight the system, she made it afraid of silence. And after all the dust, the hearings, the live streams, the arrests, the resignations, after the courtroom echo faded and the last flashbulb cooled, what remained was not just a woman, or a fine, or a firestorm on Capitol Hill. What remained was a question, a lesson, a warning carved into the bones of a nation that had grown far too comfortable watching justice happen behind closed doors. What Jasmine Crockett forced America to confront was not just corruption, but complacency. She showed the country that injustice doesn't always march in with boots. Sometimes it wears a robe. It smiles behind precedent. It hides in procedure. It disguises its power as civility. And it counts on you to sit down, to stay quiet, to trust that someone else will fight the battle you've been trying to ignore. But Jasmine didn't ignore it. She walked straight into the lion's den, not with an army or a law firm, but with memory, truth, and a refusal to bend. And the moment she refused to bow, everything else started to crack. Because in the end, the courtroom wasn't the battlefield. The real war was being waged in the silence of every citizen who had ever watched injustice on a screen and thought, "There's nothing I can do." Her story obliterated that lie. Her voice, raw, unpolished, uncompromising, cut through years of well-manicured cowardice. And when she was fined, shamed, and threatened in broad daylight, something unexpected happened. The people stood up with her. That's the message no headline can summarize. That's the danger to every broken institution that still believes fear is enough to hold back the truth. Because Jasmine Crockett proved that fear only works when we all pretend to be alone. But we're not anymore. Her defiance wasn't just for show, it was a spark, a signal flare to anyone who's ever been silenced, sidelined, or told to wait their turn. Her courage reminded us that the price of justice is not paid in comfort, but in confrontation. And the final truth, the most human one, is this. You don't have to wear a badge to stand for what's right. You don't need a robe to demand accountability. You don't even need permission to speak. You just need the will to do it when it matters most. Because as Jasmine once said, and now the world knows, if speaking the truth cost me everything, then it was worth more than I thought. And in that moment, America remembered something it had forgotten. Justice isn't what happens when the powerful allow it. It's what happens when the people demand it. And that is a lesson the system will never unlearn. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.